just a few announcements for this week. It's good to gather together virtually for this fourth Sunday in Easter. We're celebrating Earth Day today. It's a joy that we have a guest preacher, the Reverend Laurel Dykstra from Salal and Cedar Wild Church. You can read more about their biography at our website, rioterracechurch.org/live, or by Googling Salal and Cedar Wild Church. It's good to be together this morning. We are undertaking a survey of the congregation as we make plans to emerge from the pandemic and looking forward to the future to update our long-range plan. I'm very grateful to report that a quarter of our congregants have completed a survey. That's an astounding number, a full quarter. I know that we can get some more feedback, so if you are interested in providing some feedback on a very brief survey, you can do so through rioterracechurch.org right on the main page, or by visiting our This Week at RTC newsletter, which should be in your inbox. We turn now to our gathering prayers. You can follow along using the words on the screen, or tune into our bulletin at rioterracechurch.org/live.
We are one earth community, and this world is our home.
We sleep beneath one roof, the starry sky.
We warm ourselves before one hearth, the blazing sun.
Upon one soil we stand,
and breathe one air,
and drink one water.
and walk the night beneath our lumescent moon.
We are brothers and sisters of one blood.
Members of one earth family.
We gather to celebrate the gift of life and kinship.
We move now into our centering time. We offer this poem by Joy Harjo. Joy is a member of the Creek Nation of Oklahoma, and she wrote this poem in 2019. Speaking Tree. I had a beautiful dream. I was dancing with a tree. Some things on this earth are unspeakable. Genealogy of the broken, a shy wind threading leaves after a massacre, or the smell of coffee and no one there. Some humans say trees are not sentient beings, but they do not understand poetry. Nor can they hear the singing of trees when they are fed by wind or water music, or hear their cries of anguish when they are broken and bereft. Now I am a woman longing to be a tree, planted in a moist, dark earth between sunrise and sunset. I cannot walk through all realms. I carry a yearning I cannot bear alone in the dark. What shall I do with all this heartache? The deepest rooted dream of a tree is to walk, even just a little ways, from the place next to the doorway to the edge of the river of life and drink. I have heard trees talking long after the sun has gone down. Imagine what it would be like to dance close together in this land of water and knowledge, to drink deep what is undrinkable.
Good morning. There are 3 scriptures this morning, the first of which will be very familiar. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. The second reading is from John 11, chapter 11 to verse 11 to 18. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. The third reading is from Acts 9, verses 36 to 43. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydia was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with a request. Please come to us without delay. So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes. And seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner.
now welcome Laurel to offer her message. And while she is on the Zoom, while they are on the Zoom call, I had a privilege to hear Laurel's sermon before all of you, and it is prophetic. I hope you are able to hear her message and receive it.
Good morning from this Coast Salish territory to you on Treaty 6 territory. My name is Laurel Dykstra. I am the priest of Salal and Cedar, which is a little church with a vocation for ecological justice and a practice of worshiping outdoors. This day that your community is celebrating Earth Day is also Good Shepherd Sunday in the Common Lectionary. And so we have a wonderful combination of passages and ideas that we can engage with. For 50 years, on April 22nd, people all over the world have marked a growing commitment for environmental protection and for climate justice. And every year in the season of Easter, the Church engages with and grapples with the repeated biblical assertion that both kingship and divine human relations in some way resemble sheep husbandry. Our readings from Acts 9 and Psalm 23 juxtapose two ways that as people of faith we might approach creation. Pretty consistently in Scripture, God is encountered on mountaintops, under special trees, in crossings of water, at wells, at springs, and in the wilderness. And those indoor religious gathering places, the built environment, those are very often places of conflict. Green pastures, still waters, safe paths. Quiet, contemplative attention to the divine voice in creation. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters and restores my soul. In this most beloved and best known psalm, many people for whom church is firmly an indoor experience can still understand the wild church movement and the way that we at Salal and Cedar and more than 90 other communities in North America are finding connection with the divine in nature. Pleasures of the field, attention to the seasons and the senses, and a quiet wonder at the beauty of creation. Now, every time that I teach or I preach, I ask people, how many of you have experienced a sense of awe or wonder or sacredness in creation? And almost always, it's a majority who says yes. This is an avenue that is accessible to all of us. It's also deeply rooted in our tradition. But an experience of the divine in nature that is sentimentalized or disconnected from the reality of loss of biomass, climate change, and the fact that indigenous, coastal, and islander communities are disproportionately impacted by these changes and have been the leading point for resistance in this newly named crisis for decades, kind of misses the point a bit. Or perhaps what it demonstrates is that sheep in a pasture are very protected. The focus on individual spiritual encounters, just like the focus on green consumer goods or individual carbon footprints, misses the fact that salvation is a collective project. The fantastic folks from a website and a project called Queer Nature say that sheep teach us about the intelligence of the collective. So if we romanticize green pastures and still waters without context, we risk what my mother called being so spiritually minded that you're no earthly good. The contemplative ecology movement, this movement for outdoor worship, for encounter of the divine in nature, has been pretty severely critiqued by wilderness practitioners like the folks at Queer Nature, like the folks at Diversify Outdoors. Because if we're not careful, We can use nature, the more than human world, as just kind of a playground for recreation or a backdrop where we are enacting our stories but keeping ourselves centered. What we end up having is not truly kin relationships, family relationships that evidence ecological humility. Or maybe we have selective kin relationships. So the charismatic macrofauna, as they say, or the big good-looking animals that have fur and look you in the eyes, are the ones that we privilege our relationships with. But we tend to romanticize or ignore a whole lot of complex ways that other humans are also part of and interacting with the more than human world. Poor people, queer people, black and indigenous people, brown people have been and continue to engage humbly and complexly in places where the wild, domestic, the urban and rural, the spiritual and political, the creature and human collide and overlap. Which is why the reading from Acts offers us such a brilliant gift from the early church. It is fairly bristling with natural images if you know how to pay attention and where to look. It contains a whole lot of hints and evocations about the kinds of relationships, analyses, and ambiguities that a truly wild engagement might hold for us. It helps to understand some of the other kind of work that Salal and Cedar does. Not just contemplation in fields and forests, not just green pastures and still waters. We have partnered with a local church to restore wildlife habitat on their property. Following leadership from members of Tsleil-Waututh, Secwepemc, Namgis, and other indigenous nations, we oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline and open net fish farms on their unceded territories. We help to distribute health and sanitation supplies to single-room occupancy hotel residents in the downtown east side of Vancouver. We've converted a neighborhood little library into a small community pantry. We ask questions about where our own banks and those of our national church institution keep our money and what they do with it. And like the early church of Acts, our church is alive with complicated questions and trying new ways of being community together. At that time, Tabitha became ill and died. Tabitha is dead, and death was pervasive in the ancient world. With infant mortality and risk of death in childbirth, the average life expectancy of a woman in the ancient Near East was 35 to 45 years. The Roman state was ruthless, and martyrdom was the fate of many leaders of the early kingdom movement. The backdrop of Easter to these readings, the disciples hiding in fear in an upper room, is that crucifixion was appallingly ordinary. According to tradition, John is the only one of the apostles who was not executed. The Jewish community was a resistant and troublesome minority, and Jesus was not the first Jew, the first faithful Jew who died on a Roman cross outside of Jerusalem. In the 4th century BCE, Varus crucified 2,000 Jews there, and in 70 CE, Titus crucified 500 a day for an untold number of days. There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. Tabitha, or Dorcas in Greek. So we know that she is somebody who is operating biculturally. She is an Aramaic-speaking Jew in Roman-occupied Palestine. So she has to operate in her own culture and in the dominant culture. She is the only woman in the Christian Testament named as a disciple. And this story is the only record that we have of her. In both Greek and Aramaic, her name means gazelle, swift and delicate. It's a love name in biblical and in Arabic poetry, associated with feminine beauty. A powerful animal in indigenous African traditions across the entire continent. Gazelle. Today, 4 species are extinct, and most of the remaining 10 are threatened or endangered. Death is pervasive in our world as well. In our lifetimes, we have witnessed a 60% decrease in the global number of wild vertebrates. Unusually, no husband or sons are named. We don't know if Tabitha is a widow, socially vulnerable like the women who mourn her, if she's a single woman, or if her male family members just aren't important in the story. Good works and charity seem to imply that she was somebody with financial means. And a significant part of the early church was financed by women like that. The upper room, where her body has been laid, echoes and resonates with meals and gatherings and hiding out in upper rooms throughout Scripture. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Her body has been washed and laid out. There's an inescapable intimacy with bodies, dirt, and death in this passage. Dead bodies, even those of saints, are messy. Now where was Tabitha laid out? Now in Joppa there was a disciple. Since Lydda was near Joppa, this became known throughout Joppa. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time. The town appears 4 times in 8 verses, and in case we didn't get that this is a story about death and resurrection, Joppa is the town where Jonah boarded a boat to escape God's call, but ended up instead in the belly of a great fish. Today, 90% of ocean fish stocks are exhausted or being depleted. Death and birth, new life, and a great big fish. Now who do they call to Joppa? A fisherman. Simon, now called Peter the Rock, seems to have inherited after the crucifixion of Jesus this rocking boat of a new movement. So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made. He comes, and the widow's grieving is all tears and textiles. They show him the work of her hands. I wonder if any of you have seen a photograph that's been making the rounds on the internet a little while ago now of a funeral in Nebraska. When 89-year-old Margaret Hubel died, her friends and her family draped every pew in the church with a quilt that she had made for them. Tabitha's mourners show Peter the clothing that she has made. And then Peter the Rock does a Jesus thing, which is also an Elisha thing, which is also an Elijah thing. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." And then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. This story echoes other biblical stories of prophets, women, and new life. Like the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings and the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings, Tabitha the Gazelle practices some radical generosity. Like the centurion's daughter of Mark 5, a female-identified person is raised. The words that Peter says to Tabitha and that Jesus says to the young woman, to the young girl, are almost homonyms. They sound exactly the same. Now, don't these widows and wives and daughters and carers, hosts and weavers make you want to ask some questions about the role and value of the women in Judaism and in the early church? And since we're reading this passage during the flood of advertisements for Mother's Day purchases, about the role and value of women in movements today, about the way that it is women and girls who must carry the ever scarcer clean water to communities. about the way that discarded community is flooding North American landfills and countries to the global south. Who else's story is untold? The rock, Peter, prays. He speaks. He touches. And the gazelle springs up. Saints and widows rejoice. Many believe. And then Simon the rock goes to the home of Simon the tanner, who turns hides into leather, unclean because he treats the skin of dead animals with feces and urine. And this is the wild new life that we are promised. It's not all green pastures and still waters. It comes with humans and creatures and death and crap and power relationships and the complexity of whose story gets told and whose does not. Amen.
trees of the earth